Happy holidays to all our listeners, and welcome to our podcast, "'Tis But a Scratch, Fact and Fiction about the Middle Ages." I'm your host, Professor Richard Abels. My co-host, partner for life, and inspiration for all things medieval is my wife, Ellen.
Merry Christmas, Happy Hanukkah, Happy Kwanzaa, and Happy New Year to you and yours.
As our listeners may have already gathered from earlier episodes, Ellen and I are secular Jews. Ellen is a convert to Reformed Judaism, and I am, at least according to Ancestry.com, 100% Ashkenazi Jewish. Ellen grew up celebrating Christmas, and I grew up celebrating Hanukkah. For me, Christmas Day meant dinner at a Chinese restaurant and maybe a movie. Hanukkah meant 8 days of gifts, lighting the menorah, good eats, playing the dreidel game, chocolate, Hanukkah gelt, and family time. With apologies to Adam Sandler, Christians had by far the better songs. But I was comforted that some of the most popular Christmas songs were written by Jews. Irving Berlin's White Christmas, Mel Torme's Christmas Song, or Chestnuts Roasting on an Open Fire. George Weil and Eddie Pola's It's the Most Wonderful Time of the Year, and Johnny Marks' A Holly Jolly Christmas, and his Rudolph the Red-Nosed Reindeer. All these written by Jews. As I grew older and began to learn more about the history of religions, I began to have doubts about why we Jews in the U.S. make such a big deal about Hanukkah. For American Jews, Hanukkah is right up there with the three big Jewish holidays, Rosh Hashanah, Yom Kippur, and Passover.
But it shouldn't be. Probably it's closer to Purim, as both holidays celebrate the Jewish people overcoming enemies bent on wiping us out.
Hanukkah is the festival of lights. It celebrates a miracle that is said to have occurred in 164 BCE, when Jewish rebels against rule of the Hellenistic Seleucid Empire took Jerusalem and re-sanctified the Second Temple. The temple had been religiously polluted by Emperor Antiochus IV Epiphanes 3 years before, when he had an altar to Zeus erected within it. This was part of a larger program by Antiochus to suppress, or more accurately, revise Jewish religious practices to bring them in line with Hellenistic religion and culture. Our best source for these matters is the 1st century CE Jewish historian and general Josephus. Josephus tells us that Antiochus mistook an internal dispute between two claimants to the Jewish high priesthood, both of whom had bribed him and both of whom were Hellenized Jews, for the beginnings of a Jewish uprising. Already engaged in an unsuccessful war against the rival Ptolemaic dynasty of Egypt, Antiochus decided to take decisive action to forestall the rebellion. According to Josephus, quote, "And when the king had built an idol altar upon God's altar, he slew swine upon it, and offered a sacrifice neither according to the law nor the Jewish religious worship in that country. He also compelled the Jewish people to forsake the worship which they paid their own God, and to adore those whom he took to be gods, and made them build temples and raise idol altars in every city and village, and offer swine upon them every day. He also commanded them not to circumcise their sons, and threatened to punish any that should be found to have transgressed his injunction."
I can understand their injunction against circumcision. To judge from statues, Hellenistic Greeks believed the naked male body to be beautiful, and circumcision must have seemed an act of mutilation.
The Romans, who respected ancient religions, tolerated circumcision when they later ruled Judea, but they also considered it to be a perverse superstition. Okay. The king also appointed overseers to compel the Jews to do what he commanded, and indeed there were many Jews who complied with the king's commands, either voluntarily or out of fear of the penalty announced for disobedience. But the best men, those with the noblest souls, paid greater respect to the customs of their country than to the orders of the king, and were not deterred by the punishments with which the king threatened the disobedient. Because of that, every day these noblemen suffered great miseries and bitter torments. They were whipped with rods, their bodies were torn to pieces, and they were crucified while they were still alive. The king also ordered women who had their sons circumcised to be strangled along with their babies. As they suffered upon the crosses, he had the bodies of their sons hung about their necks. If any sacred book or scroll of the law was found, it was destroyed, and those who possessed them miserably perished also.
Ew. I mean, how seriously should we take these atrocity stories?
I think it's probably exaggerated. Josephus wrote Antiquities of the Jews to present Jews in a favorable light to his first-century Hellenistic audience. These atrocities provide an explanation for the Maccabean revolt with which those readers might sympathize. I have no doubt that Antiochus IV prohibited the ritual of circumcision and ordered pagan temples and altars erected. The sacrifice of pigs upon these altars was an obvious in-your-face to Jewish ritual food taboos, which must have seemed as irrational to the Hellenistic Greeks as circumcision. Josephus's acknowledgment that many Jews complied with Antiochus's commands voluntarily is telling.
But more didn't, and the result was that Antiochus precipitated the very Jewish uprising he was working to nip in the bud.
The revolt began when a Jewish priest named Mattathias of the Hasmonean clan killed another Jewish priest as he prepared to sacrifice a pig on the altar dedicated to Zeus. Mattathias and his sons fled into the desert and took refuge in caves. Many others followed them, and what began as local resistance grew into a national uprising. Mattathias died soon after, but leadership of the revolt was assumed by his son, Judas Maccabee, Judah the Hammer.
Like Charles Martel.
Although it was to be a decade before the Jewish revolt was fully successful, within 3 years, Judah's army was able to enter Jerusalem and recover the temple for Jewish worship. The ritual of resanctification, rededication of the temple took 8 days.
And now we finally come to the miracle. The story is that when they entered the temple, they discovered only a single container of ritual olive oil, still enclosed with the chief rabbi's seal. This was enough for just a single night, but it lasted for a full 8 days, just enough time for the Jewish priests to be able to obtain a whole new batch of sanctified olive oil. And this miracle is commemorated with the lighting of the menorah, a 9-branch candelabrum. As odd as it sounds, one of my most prized family possessions is a hand-wrought menorah that my grandmother somehow acquired near Springfield, Massachusetts during the Great Depression.
I remember how surprised I was when you first showed the menorah to me. It's literally unique. Although the base is machine-made, the branches and the Jewish star at the center are all hand-wrought. It really is odd that this is a family heirloom from the Irish Catholic side of the family. Menorahs were part of my entire childhood. My grandparents were Orthodox Jews, and although my parents grew up in entirely Jewish neighborhoods in Brooklyn, they became secular Jews. The only time I remember my father or mother going to a synagogue was for my bar mitzvah. Nevertheless, we celebrated Hanukkah. I grew up lighting menorah candles and receiving gifts for each of the 8 days. But even as a kid, the miracle at the center of Hanukkah never struck me as all that impressive. It's certainly not in the same league as parting the Red Sea. As I grew older, I discovered that the story of the miracle doesn't even appear in any of the earliest sources for the events, the first and second books of the Maccabees, which were written around 100 BCE, and Josephus's The Antiquities of the Jews, written for a Roman audience around 94 CE. The first mention of the miracle occurs in the Megillat Antiochus, the scroll of Antiochus, written perhaps as early as the 2nd century CE, and appears in the Gemara portion of the Babylonian Talmud, which was written down around 500 CE.
The Talmud, in case some of our listeners don't know, is the central text of Rabbinic Judaism. It comprises the Mishnah, the oral religious law of Rabbinic Judaism, which was first committed in writing in the early 3rd century, and the Gemara, rabbinic analysis and debate over the meaning of the Torah, both written and oral.
When I taught Western and World Civ, I would explain to my students who thought that by reading the Old Testament, they were getting the straight dope on Judaism, that the relationship between the Talmud and the Torah is very similar to the relationship between the U.S. Constitution and all of constitutional law. You don't really understand the Constitution unless you understand how it has been interpreted.
Over the years, you seem to have become less and less enthusiastic about celebrating Hanukkah.
Yeah, that's true. It's not because I think that it's a bogus Jewish festival. As a festival, it really belongs on the same perch as Sukkot and Purim. My problem is that, at least in the U.S., it has become the Jewish Christmas. I can understand why. As a Jewish kid growing up, I would have been a lot more envious of my Christian friends if I didn't have a holiday in which I would get 8 gifts. Okay, little gifts, but still 8 of them. Christians may have the Christmas tree and Christmas decoration, but we have a menorah, and some Jewish families even had a Hanukkah bush. We didn't, but I know some who did. But Hanukkah shouldn't be the Jewish Christmas. Christmas is one of the major holidays in the Christian religious calendar, second only to Easter. Hanukkah doesn't have that status. A holiday celebrating the resistance of Jews to assimilation has become, in the U.S., an emblem of American Jewish assimilation into the dominant Christian culture. And that strikes me as highly ironic. Hanukkah celebrates the Maccabean rebellion against not only Hellenistic rule, but Jewish assimilation into the Hellenistic culture. The Maccabees regarded Hellenized Jews as great an enemy as pagan Greeks, and I'm the modern American version of a Hellenized Jew.
If you remember, years ago when we belonged to a Reformed Jewish temple, after a sermon about the Hanukkah spirit by the rabbi, I told his wife, the Rebbitzin, that I had trouble getting motivated to celebrate the Maccabees, a bunch of people who would have, put us all Reformed Jews to death. And, of course, the Rebbitzin just glared at me.
Yeah, I loved your relationship with her. She glared at you equally after you told her that the TV show Buffy the Vampire Slayer wasn't really about magic and demons, but was a metaphor.
Several metaphors. And the idea that high school was located over the mouth of hell would have explained so much for many of us.
Again, I understand from personal experience why Hanukkah is so important to American Jewish kids and their parents. The leaders of the Chabad Lubavitch movement of Orthodox Judaism are equally aware of the importance of Hanukkah to secular American Jews. Unlike other Hasidim groups who segregate themselves from the secular culture, Chabad has a tradition of outreach. Chabad regards it as a mitzvah, a blessing, to recall to the faith non-religious Jews, and this has led to Chabad's complex relationship with Hanukkah. On the one hand, Chabad understands the religious meaning of Hanukkah and its status in the Jewish festival calendar, but beginning in the 1970s, they began to actively encourage public celebrations of Hanukkah. They believed that they could use the popularity of Hanukkah among secular Jews as an instrument to reach them. I'm sure that they were also aware of the irony of using Hanukkah in this fashion. Chabad is as aware as the Maccabees were of the dangerous attraction that secularism holds for Jews living in an alien religious culture. Mr. Z. Freeman wrote a very interesting article for the Chabad.com website entitled, "Why Couldn't Jews and Greeks Just Get Along?" Mr. Freeman credits the Greeks with being universalists, syncretists, and rationalists. Jews, he also acknowledges, are syncretists, at least to an extent. Quote, "Whatever your grandmother told you," he writes, "Abraham did not smear the gefilte fish with crane." End quote.
Crane? Gefilte fish I know, but crane?
Horseradish.
Oh, okay.
So why couldn't the Hellenistic Greeks and Jews compromise? The Hasidic answer is that the problem is that the Hellenistic Greeks were rationalists. They couldn't fathom or accept the Jewish monotheism that rejected the very existence of all other gods or the conception of an ineffable God beyond human comprehension. It's telling that the practices that Antiochus singled out for suppression were those that struck the Greeks as just plain irrational. Why would you mutilate your male babies? Why can't you eat something as delicious as pork or even handle a pig? Why do you get so upset when I worship my gods? I don't object to you worshiping yours. Again, I find it ironic that Chabad has elevated Hanukkah into a major Jewish holiday as a lure to bring secular Jews back into the fold. It's a recognition of the deadly attraction of assimilation into a dominant culture. Mr. Freeman quotes the venerated late Lubavitcher Rebbe Menachem Mendel Schneerson, quote, "In Hebrew, the name for ancient Greece, Yavam, has another meaning, quicksand. Water mixes with sand, dirt, and clay. You step in it, and you can't get out. The more you try to climb up, the further down you go." That's assimilation. I've toyed with the idea of writing a book entitled From Maccabees to Wannabes, a history of Jewish assimilation, which would have a chapter in it on Hanukkah.
Starting your personal war on Hanukkah.
Now, if Hanukkah were a pagan festival like Christmas is...
Oh, stop. I know that you're channeling Cromwell and the Puritans of New England when you say that. Although this episode is about Hanukkah, how about a little detour into the history of Christmas in medieval and early modern England? And you might explain why the Puritans in England and New England banned Christmas celebrations.
Gladly. Basically, the Puritans dismissed Christmas as a religious holiday because it failed the scripture test.
The scripture test?
Yeah. Luther, Calvin, and other classical Protestant reformers believed that the Bible alone is the infallible source for all Christian faith and practice. If a practice or belief is not explicitly mentioned in the Bible, it's to be rejected. This applied to purgatory, prayers for the dead, indulgences, clerical celibacy, and to Christmas. Jesus' birth date does not appear anywhere in the New Testament, and there is no biblical foundation for celebrating his birth.
That's ironic. The fiercest modern-day warriors defending Christmas are evangelical and fundamentalist Christians.
That actually has been pointed out by some evangelical pastors, but it's definitely a minority opinion. On the other hand, 16th and 17th century Puritan theologians were well aware that whenever Christ was born, it was unlikely to have been on December 25th. They knew from their study of antiquity and the early church that December 25th had been both the climax of the multi-day celebration of Saturnalia and that the Emperor Valerian in the mid-3rd century had established December 25th as the festival of the Dies Natalis Solis Invicti, the day of the birth of the unconquered sun.
Unconquered sun? That sounds like Mithras, but that makes sense. I mean, it also marks the winter solstice, and it makes sense that the early church would appropriate these important pagan festivals. I mean, after all, Christian Roman emperors from Constantine on transformed pagan temples into Christian basilicas.
Yeah. It makes perfect sense pragmatically. It wasn't until the 4th century after the Emperor Constantine converted to Christianity that December 25th was recognized as Jesus' birthday. The appropriation, rather than the attempted suppression, of a popular festival would have eased the transition from Roman paganism to Roman Christianity. I have no idea whether this was a conscious decision by churchmen to associate Christ with the unconquered sun. And no, I'm not going to do a pun about the Son of God.
Thank you.
Yeah, but it was an effective mechanism for making the new religion familiar and acceptable. But Puritans weren't concerned about pragmatism. They were only interested in the truth with a capital T. And December 25th failed that test.
I know that the Puritans in Parliament banned the religious and secular celebration of Christmas in 1647 as popish and superstitious. Okay, what made it popish?
Partly because the Puritans thought the holiday was invented by the Catholic Church, and partly because the religious part of the holiday involved 3 Christmas masses.
Oh, that's why it's Christ Mass.
Exactly. The 3 masses were the Angels' Mass, celebrated at midnight, the Shepherd's Mass at dawn, and the Mass of the Divine Word, celebrated during the day.
And of course, if you're Catholic, the Mass at midnight and the Mass of dawn are still celebrated.
Christmas, of course. This was about as popish as one could get. In 1645, Parliament prohibited the celebration of the 3 masses. Secular festivities, however, were not then banned. One royalist sympathizer was provoked to comment, "Oh, blessed Reformation, the church doors all shut and the tavern doors all open." 2 years later, the tavern doors were closed and Parliament ordered Christmas Day to be a work day. The result was riots in Oxford and Cambridge.
Apparently, people were more upset by the abolition of the secular holiday than the religious observance.
They were, not the least because religious festivals were days off from work, and the secular festivities involved lots of feasting and drinking. In the Middle Ages and early modern period, Christmas was celebrated for 12 full days, from December 25th until January 6th, the Feast of the Epiphany, celebrating the visit of the wise men bearing gifts to the baby Jesus.
Was that the origin of the exchange of gifts at Christmas?
Gift-giving on Christmas Day was not part of the medieval celebration. Gifts, however, were given on January 1st to celebrate the New Year, which was a continuation of pagan Roman practice. And before you ask, Santa Claus was also not part of medieval Christmas, although his Saint's Day, 6th of December, was during Advent.
Is that why St. Nicholas got drawn into the Christmas story?
Having a Saint's Day in December certainly helped, but I think that it was Nicholas's association with gift-giving that really did it. St. Nicholas is actually a late addition to the Christmas story. He only became Santa Claus in the 19th century, at which time he pretty much displaced the traditional British Father Christmas. Father Christmas had been a jolly figure, to be sure, but he was jolly because he encouraged public drinking and feasting. He wasn't a gift giver, but St. Nicholas was. In the late medieval Netherlands and other northern European countries, December 6th, the feast day of St. Nicholas, was celebrated with the giving of gifts to children. This was because of St. Nicholas's reputation for generosity and his concern for the young. The tradition of giving gifts at Christmas, I suspect, is a merger between the gift-giving on December 6th, the feast of St. Nicholas, and the gift-giving on January 1st, the New Year's gift.
So who was the historical St. Nicholas?
Nicholas was an early 4th century bishop of Myra, a city now in Turkey. Among the stories told about him was how he saved 3 young women from being forced into prostitution. Their father, quote, through the plotting and envy of Satan, end quote, had lost all of his wealth and could not afford the dowries needed to marry off his 3 daughters. Nicholas, not wanting to humiliate the poor man, went to the man's house at night and secretly threw in a purse filled with gold coins. He was discovered out only the 3rd time he did this, but made the man promise not to tell anyone about his acts of generosity.
Apparently that didn't work, since we have the story.
Yeah. Nicholas is also the patron saint of children, although the story of how he became their patron saint is not the sort of story you tell children.
But I'm sure you're going to tell us. Go for it.
Yeah. According to this legend, there was a cruel butcher who during a time of famine lured 3 young boys into his shop. He killed them and threw their bodies into a curing barrel to be later sold as ham.
Ew.
This is probably a late addition to the St. Nicholas legend, since it doesn't appear in any of the early lives of the saint. The butcher also had the very un-Turkish name of Sweeney Todd.
Oh, please, you couldn't resist, could you?
Nah, I couldn't. Okay, I would say I'm sorry, but I'm not really sorry. Okay,
Figures.
Back to the story. When Bishop Nicholas entered the shop, he immediately sensed that a terrible deed had been committed. Drawn to the barrel, he made the sign of the cross over it, and the 3 boys, restored to life, crawled out of the barrel.
Okay. If medieval Christmas wasn't about gift-giving, what was it about?
One gets a good sense of the medieval Christmas activities from a letter written by Margaret Paston on Christmas Eve in 1459, inquiring how a neighbor had celebrated Christmas the previous year after she had been recently widowed. She was told that the lady had forbidden her household from play acting, playing musical instruments, singing, and lewd sports. She permitted them, however, to play backgammon, chess, and cards.
I won't ask about the lewd sports, but play acting?
Christmas was closely associated with play acting.
Mumming. Okay.
In London, it was a season for attending plays, but in villages, the play acting was called, as you said, mumming. Men would put on animal masks or dress up as women and go from house to house singing folk songs.
Like caroling.
Yes, but not songs about Jesus or Christmas. In Scandinavia, mumming was more sinister. In early modern Scandinavia, young men put on devil's masks or dressed up as trolls or ghosts to frighten their neighbors at night.
Sounds more like Halloween than Christmas.
The first and authentic Nightmare Before Christmas.
Okay. I understand why the Puritans banned the religious celebration of Christmas as too Roman Catholic, but why did they also prohibit the traditional secular celebration?
I think you know. They found the secular festivities too pagan and too disorderly.
Too pagan, like the Christmas tree, which seems to have had its roots in Norse religious practice.
Yeah, sacred trees played a central role in Scandinavian and early Germanic paganism. They would be decorated with war trophies and the bodies of sacrificed animals, in some instances, the bodies of sacrificed people.
Sounds festive.
Yeah. In the Middle Ages, churchmen would decorate trees outside their church with apples on Christmas Day, celebrating Adam and Eve. By the 15th century, in England and Germany, villagers would decorate fir trees with holly, ivy, and paper decorations as part of the Christmas celebration.
So the Puritans reacted to the traditional Christmas celebration much as they reacted to the traditional May Day celebration.
Yeah, Puritans disapproved of festivals that featured feasting, drinking, revelry, play acting, and dancing.
Yeah, like H.L. Mencken's famous definition of Puritanism as the haunting fear that someone, somewhere, might be happy.
Yeah. Historian J.A.R. Pimlott has a nice article about Puritan attitudes towards Christmas in the magazine History Today. He quotes Philip Stubbs, an early Puritan, who complained about Christmas in his Anatomy of Abuses, written in 1583, quote, "Who is ignorant that at Christmas time more mischief is committed than in all the year besides? What masking and mumming, whereby robberies, whoredom, murder, and what not is committed? What dicing and carding, what banqueting and feasting is then used more than all the year besides." Another Puritan, William Prynne, in a circular condemning the immorality of the theater, fingered Christmas as the worst example of a festival devoted to theater going. It promoted behavior that, quote, was amorous, voluptuous, unchristian, and even involved pagan dancing.
Oh, the horror.
Why, Prynne asked, could not the English nation observe festivals, and especially Christmas, without drinking, roaring, healthing?
Healthing?
Drinking to one's health.
That's a bad thing?
Yeah. It's synonymous with wassailing. Wassail comes from the Old Norse veshail and Old English washal, literally to be in good health. The wassail toast was a 12th night tradition in medieval and early modern English villages. Tenants would go to the house of the lord of the village and offer a toast to his good health. The toast would be with beer provided by the lord.
Okay.
The lord would give them food and drink in return.
Like the Christmas carol. Here we come a-wassailing.
Exactly.
Here we come a-wassailing among the leaves so green. Here we come a-wandering so fair to be seen. Love and joy come to you, and to you your wassail too. And God bless you and send you a happy new year. And God send you a happy new year. We are most daily beggars who beg from door to door, but we are neighbors' children whom you have seen before. Love and joy come to you, and to you your wassail too. And God bless you and send you a happy new year. And God send you a happy new year.
What I find particularly interesting is the lyric, "We are not beggars that beg from door to door, but we are neighbors' children whom you have seen before."
So this emphasizes that this is a traditional exchange of gifts, food and drink, in return for good wishes of health. Okay.
Exactly. So back to Prynne's complaint. Why can't the English observe Christmas without dicing, carding, masks, and stage plays, which better become the sacrifices of Bacchus than the resurrection, the incarnation of our most beloved Savior? If Turks and infidels were to behold the bacchanalian Christmas extravagance, would they not think our Savior to be a glutton, an epicure, a wine bibber, a devil, a friend of publicans and sinners? The celebrations were derived from the Saturnalia and the Bacchanalia. Christmas, as it was kept, could be more truly termed Devil's Mass or Saturn's Mass. End quote.
Well, at least it wasn't commercialized.
I was about to say that.
Beat you to it.
Most Puritans probably were not as over-the-top as Stubbs and Prynne, but Puritan society was meant to be godly and orderly. God wanted it that way, and Christmas revels were anything but orderly. In fact, Christmas revelries encouraged temporary disorder and rituals in which the social hierarchy was inverted.
When the world turned upside down. Anthropologists see rituals of inversion as sort of pressure valves in traditional societies that ultimately reinforce the hierarchy.
I see that in practice, or at least I saw that in practice, at the traditional society known as the United States Naval Academy.
Okay.
Now, in medieval England and France, there were both clerical and lay rituals of inversion. Priests and deacons, for instance, celebrated a Feast of Fools on January 1st, during which the church hierarchy and discipline was suspended. Historian David Roos quotes a 15th century French account condemning the practice. Quote, "Priests and clerks may be seen wearing masks and monstrous visages at the hours of office. They dance in the choir dressed as women, panders or minstrels. They sing wanton songs. They eat black puddings while the celebrant is saying mass. They play at dice. They run and leap through the church without a blush of their own shame."
I would have paid to see that.
So would I. Among the rituals of role reversal was the Christmas boy bishop. In England, in cathedral schools on December 28th, the Feast of the Holy Innocents massacred by King Herod, a boy from the choir would be elected to serve as the Christmas bishop. He would preach a sermon, hold a procession, and make visitation to other churches where he would receive gifts. In late medieval Germany and Scandinavia, the Christmas bishop was chosen from apprentices in guilds. One account from Denmark describes how someone became the bishop. Quote, "Christmas bishop is the name of a young man who is consecrated bishop in a Christmas game, which goes as follows. They place one from their own guild, that is to say the guild of unmarried people, on a chair, blacken his face and put a stick in his mouth with a piece of candle on the other end. Then the young men and women run around him in a circle and sing, quote, 'We consecrate a Christmas bishop pro nobis.' And when this had been done 3 times, he had been consecrated Christmas bishop," end quote. Of course, the Christmas bishop had duties to perform. Quote, "He marries as many couples from the guild as he wants while making strange faces and speaking in a feigned voice. And then the married couples must offer something. Those offering something which is not good enough are hit by a bag filled with ashes that the bishop has kept under his cape," end quote. These marriages lasted 1 night. A tradition continued at some modern-day Christmas office parties.
Oh, okay.
I owe that reference, and not the comment about office Christmas parties, to Peter Knitsky, the co-creator and editor of a wonderful website for all things medieval, medievalists.net.
I like that.
The secular version of the boy bishop was the Lord of Misrule. Twelfth Night was celebrated with games and festivities to accompany one final Christmas feast. The Lord of Misrule was in charge of the festivities. He was chosen by chance. A bean was baked within a fruitcake. Whoever received the slice of cake with the bean became the Lord of Misrule.
Okay, I can see why the banning of Christmas celebrations could lead to riots. Were the riots effective in restoring the celebrations of Christmas in England?
Nope. But the restoration of the monarchy in 1660 did the trick. Christmas returned to England along with King Charles II. New England, as was often the case, lingered behind.
As it did with witch trials.
Yeah. In 1659, the legislature of the Massachusetts Bay Colony made it illegal to celebrate Christmas. The penalty was 5 shillings. It wasn't until 1681 that the law was repealed under pressure from London. That marked the end of the only historically real war on Christmas.
Let's just say happy holidays, regardless of how and what and why you celebrate.
Happy holidays? Isn't that part of the war on Christmas? Shouldn't you be saying Merry Christmas?
It's Happy Holidays
Okay.
or whatever. I personally would never kick an expression of goodwill in the teeth, no matter how it's phrased. But
Yeah.
anyway, let's just say Happy Holidays, regardless of how and why you celebrate them. So far, we've talked a lot about Christmas in medieval and early modern England, but not a whole lot about medieval Hanukkah. And you did promise a medieval historian's reflection on Hanukkah. So, how was Hanukkah celebrated in the Middle Ages?
Okay, one of the reasons why we have more about Christmas than Hanukkah is that there's just more evidence for medieval Christmas than for medieval Hanukkah.
Or
But-
medieval Jewish anything.
For medieval Jewish anything.
Okay.
But what we do have suggests that much like medieval Christmas, Hanukkah was a festive holiday celebrated with a lot of feasting and a lot of public drinking.
Okay.
Hanukkah, like Purim, was a festival rather than a somber holy day. Both celebrated the survival of the Jewish people and the Jewish faith against those who sought their destruction. The one medieval hymn associated with Hanukkah, Ma'od Tzor, Rock of My Salvation, thought to have been composed in Germany in the late 12th century, is a poem that celebrates God's deliverance of the Jewish people from their ancient enemies, Pharaoh, Nebuchadnezzar, Haman, and Antiochus. The last stanza calls upon God to wreak vengeance upon the, quote, wicked nations, end quote, now persecuting the Jews, implied to be Christianity. This makes sense given that the hymn was composed during the Crusades, and the Rhineland was the birthplace of the pogrom.
It's depressing that this hymn continues to be so relevant. I suspect it will carry special meaning this year when sung by cantors in Israel and throughout the Jewish world.
I suspect that you're right. The hymn gives a sense of the fragility felt by the Jews of Western Europe in the Middle Ages as a hated outgroup. But it also celebrates the continued existence of the Jewish people in the face of that enmity and that persecution. It isn't surprising that the two festivals that celebrated the survival of the people, Hanukkah and Purim, were celebrated by public drinking and feasting.
So, in a way, not that different from how Christmas was celebrated in the Middle Ages.
When you put it that way, yeah.
But you did promise a medieval historian's reflection on Hanukkah. So, was Hanukkah celebrated in the Middle Ages?
It was, and it was celebrated as a really festive holiday. I should begin with a confession. I'm not an expert on medieval Jewish life, or for that matter, on medieval Jewish festivals. I'm going to be drawing on the research and expertise of scholars such as Dr. Kate Stevenson and Dr. Susan Weingarten. As I said, Hanukkah was celebrated by the Jewish communities of medieval Western Europe, in fact, to a greater extent than in early Judaism.
Isn't Hanukkah mentioned in the Talmud?
Only in a couple of places, and the holiday is not sanctioned by Scripture. The two books of the Maccabees are Jewish apocrypha. They are not part of the canonical Hebrew Bible. They are, however, found in the Septuagint, the 2nd century BCE Greek Old Testament, which held far greater authority among the early Gentile Christian communities than among Jews, whose scribes compiled between the 7th and 10th centuries the canonical Masoretic Old Testament based upon Hebrew texts.
So why did Hanukkah become more popular in the Middle Ages, and how is it celebrated?
It's easier to explain the how than the why. Hanukkah, like Purim, was a festival rather than a somber holy day. Both were celebrated by public drinking and feasting.
That explains a lot right there.
Yeah. Two Jewish texts from 14th century Provence tell us about the food dishes that were prepared for the Hanukkah celebration. One is a satiric poem called Avon Bohan by a rabbi from All that includes a list of foods consumed on each of the Jewish festivals. The other is a medieval rendition of the Book of Judith called the Megillat Yehudik. What both festivals also shared was a permissive attitude toward female participation.
I can understand why that would be true of Purim. After all, Purim celebrates Queen Esther, wife of the Persian great king Ahasuerus, for foiling the evil machinations of the royal vizier Haman to kill the Jews.
And giving us delicious Hamantasha.
Hamantashen.
And for giving us delicious Hamantasha.
Tashen.
For giving us Hamantashen, for God's sake. And medieval Hanukkah celebrated similarly the salvation of the Jewish people by another heroine, the beautiful widow Judith, which is why the medieval Megillat Yehudik, the Scroll of Judith, is a treasure trove of information about medieval Hanukkah.
Wait a minute. Hanukkah celebrates the Hasmonean triumph over the Seleucid king Antiochus. And the last time I checked, the Maccabees were all male. And didn't Judith save the Jews by seducing an Assyrian general, getting him first dead drunk and then cutting off his head?
Yeah, that's how it appears in the Book of Judith, a deuterocanonical text written probably in the 2nd century BCE in Greek.
Deuterocanonical?
Yeah. Fancy word meaning a book of Jewish apocrypha accepted as scriptural by the Roman Catholic and Eastern Orthodox Christian churches, but not by Protestants, or for that matter, by Jews. And yes, in the Book of Judith, Holofernes is an Assyrian general. But by the Middle Ages, Judith had been transferred in time to the era of the Maccabees, and Holofernes had become a Hellenistic general.
Oddly appropriate if the Book of Judith was written in the time of the Maccabees, as you seem to suggest.
And it probably was. So Hanukkah became a sort of bookend to Purim. Both celebrated women who saved the Jewish people, and in both cases, by using their feminine wiles and charm. And both proved to be femme fatales, at least as far as Haman and Holofernes were concerned. Medieval rabbis explained that it was because Hanukkah celebrated Judith that women were allowed to participate in the religious ritual of lighting the menorah candles.
I would hope so. But what about the Maccabees? I mean, weren't they central to medieval Hanukkah?
Not as much as in earlier and later times.
Why not?
I can only speculate about that. My suspicion is that Christians co-opted the Maccabees, making them prototypes of crusaders. By the 12th century, the Maccabees had become Christian heroes. The two books of the Maccabees, after all, part of the Christian scriptural canon, both in the Roman West and the Byzantine East. It was not part of the Hebrew Bible. I think that may be why Hanukkah was recentered on Judith. Like I said, this is pure speculation.
Makes sense, though. Okay, but back to food. What kinds of food were considered proper for a medieval Hanukkah celebration? And I'm guessing it wasn't potato latkes or gefilte fish.
Alas, no.
Alas?
I like gefilte fish. We could begin with something called leverwort, which are fried pancakes, and with that ever-delicious dish, salted cheese. And the reason for that is because they are both associated with the Judith story. According to the Megillat Yehudik, Judith plied Holofernes with leverwort and salted cheese to make him thirsty. He quenched that thirst with cup after cup of wine, finally passing out.
Which is when she beheaded it.
The rest is history, or at least it's legend.
And the subject for a lot of Renaissance art.
Yeah, which is the reason why Judith is probably well known. Other foods included honeyed porridge, pan-fried honey cakes, and boiled dough, sort of like bagels. This accompanied meat dishes. Public drinking was not only permitted, but encouraged.
Maybe they kind of missed the point of the story. Don't get drunk if there's a vengeful lady nearby with a knife in her hand?
Yeah.
Okay, never mind.
It was probably more to make the holiday like Purim. These festivals were communal celebrations. This is underscored by a halakhic opinion, a judgment about Judaic law, made by a 13th century German rabbi, Maya ben Baruch of Rothenburg. The rabbi prescribed a year-long fast for any woman whose child died while under her care in a preventable accident. Quote, to fast for a full year without eating meat or drinking wine, Rabbi Maya added, with the exception of Sabbaths, festivals, the new moon, Hanukkah, and Purim, when not only should she refrain from fasting, but she should eat meat and drink wine, end quote.
Okay. I noticed that nobody mentioned gift-giving.
And the reason for that is it wasn't part of Hanukkah in the Middle Ages.
As it wasn't part of Christmas in the Middle Ages.
It wasn't even part of Hanukkah in America until the late 19th century.
Makes sense.
Before then, Purim was the holiday on which gifts were exchanged. Gift giving became part of Hanukkah because of Christmas. In the early 19th century, Christmas was a minor holiday in both America and Britain. It grew in importance throughout the 19th century, and in 1870 was made a national holiday by Congress. It was after this that Purim's gift-giving was transferred to Hanukkah. But according to Diane Ashton, director of American Studies at Rowan University and author of Hanukkah in America, A History, the tradition of exchanging Hanukkah gifts really took off only in the 1950s. At this time, Jewish child psychologists as well as rabbis started promoting gifts as a way to make post-Holocaust Jewish kids happy to be Jewish rather than sad about missing out on Christmas, which pretty much returns us to the beginning of this episode.
I never thought you'd be the Grinch who ruined Hanukkah.
No, if you remember, we gave Hanukkah gifts to the kids until they grew out of it. It's the American Jewish way.
Cynical to the end. Still, I hope everyone has a wonderful and safe holiday season.
And when I picked up our daughter, Rebecca, to bring her home for the holidays, she informed me that we are lighting the candles in the menorah tonight because, in her words, it's so beautiful. So to our Jewish listeners, Chag Urim Sameach. Happy Festival of Lights.
Much better.
Until next year, bye for now.